Perfect. So with that, I'm going to start tonight's program by introducing Dr. Jeff Hoover. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you tonight and introduce you to Dr. Jeff Hoover, who will be telling us about his research that spans more than 3 decades. Jeff is an avian ecologist in the Illinois Natural History Survey at the Prairie Research Institute and has been there since 2001. Jeff studies many interesting things, including the interactions between brood parasites and hosts, the effects of forest management on eastern wild turkeys, and breeding forest birds in general. And Jeff is also interested in the links between habitat restoration and bird conservation. For the past 30 years, Jeff has studied the ecology of birds, particularly migratory songbirds, in primarily forest and some grassland ecosystems in the Midwest and Eastern US. Of particular interest to this group is, and this is just one of the many interesting things that Jeff studies, is a 20-year long-term project studying breeding populations of Prothonotary Warblers in southern Illinois. Jeff's research has featured many times in very well-respected journals, and to just give you an idea, in 2020 alone, these are just some publications that were featured in well-known journals such as Frontiers in Ecology and Evolution and Journal of Avian Biology. And I'm sure we'll hear much more about all of these interesting research projects in tonight's talk. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff. Please take it away.
Great. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk with you. For decades, I loved going and giving these talks in person, and I know that Zoom is currently the way. And I am in my basement. That's what you see behind me. But I'm just excited to still have opportunities to do this kind of thing. And at some point, I'll be able to get the show on the road, and everybody will be able to meet in person and do this again. What I'm going to talk about tonight, and I'll share my screen in just a minute. I'll just kind of set it up. Is kind of a composition of a variety of different types of studies that I've been involved with a common theme, and that is kind of studying birds to gain information, insight into how conservation actions can improve bird populations. And this is by studying long-term work with specific individual populations of birds, to studying their behavior and linking that behavior back to conservation efforts. And so I'm going to kind of walk through tonight for you several different kind of like vignettes of research that I've done. And I will try to not bore you with statistics and to have lots of pretty pictures and graphs that kind of give you the message rather than, like I said, boring you with statistical analyses. So this is the kind of talk I love giving because it's a very upbeat story in general, based on, as was alluded to, almost 30 years of doing bird research. And so I will.
We were talking so much at the beginning of the session that we forgot to even try out the presentation.
Sure.
It works.
Yeah. Let me do this. It'll be up in a second. Okay. Share that screen.
Perfect. We can see our first intro.
Okay. And I'm going to optimize for video clip because I have a couple of video clips. Okay, so can you see this fine?
Yes, we see what I assume is a beautiful swan.
Yes, Yep. And are the buttons hidden up at the top of it?
No, they're not hidden. We can see them.
Okay. How do I make those go away?
They're not overlapping much with the presentation, so I don't think there'll be much of an issue.
Got you. Okay. Okay. So this is the title of my talk, What Birds Can Tell Us, Conservation Successes and New Insights into Remarkable Bird Behavior. I'm with the Illinois Natural History Survey, now within the Prairie Research Institute at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And ironically, for as long as I've been here, I've done very little local research. So I spent probably most of my time over the course of since 1993, being in Illinois, working in South Central and extreme Southern Illinois, and a little bit also up in the northern part of the state. And this is actually a photograph taken in Southern Illinois in a bald cypress swamp. So Southern Illinois is far enough south that there are some really amazing swamps there. Bottomland forest ecosystems have been where I've spent most of my time doing my research, and so they'll be featured fairly prominently in this talk tonight. Bottomland forests are amazing ecosystems. They harbor high levels of biodiversity, they provide flood storage capacity, and they also filter water. So you have aspects of them that are wonderful for the natural world. You also have aspects of them that are also very useful for humans in terms of storage capacity and the filtering of water. Bottomland forests are extremely biodiverse and very, there's incredible amounts of habitat heterogeneity because of a very kind of mouthful of a term, and that's Fluvial Geomorphology. And essentially, that term encompasses the fact that in bottomland forest systems, you have the combination of geology and hydrology, which creates all of these different types of habitats within a floodplain system or a bottomland system. You have the main river channel, you have oxbow lakes, you've got off-channel wetlands, and then oftentimes you've got ridges or bluffs as well. And so this habitat diversity is what really drives and promotes the biodiversity. And this biodiversity can be seen in things like aquatics, where you have a wide variety of fish species that actually inhabit the main river channel, but also these off-channel wetlands and oxbow lakes that are no longer connected to the river, or that get connected to the river through the typical flooding that occurs there. Reptiles and amphibians are also incredibly diverse in bottomland forest systems. Here's an image of a cottonmouth with a mosquito trying to bite it, which is a kind of an ironic image, but this is a picture from Southern Illinois. So the bottomland forests in Illinois have water moccasins in them, among a myriad of other types of reptiles and amphibians. Several species of turtles, snakes, salamanders, you name it. From my own perspective and interest in birds, bottomland forests harbor an amazing diversity of bird species as well. From canopy-dwelling species like cerulean and yellow-throated warblers and prothonotary warblers, which are actually not a canopy species, but down near the lower parts of the forest, to large water birds like great blue herons, and also waterfowl like wood ducks. And before I go any further with talking about some of the different types of research we've done and what those results have been, I just want to introduce some of the longer term members of the Cash Bird team, as they were known as back when a lot of this data was collected, and that included 2 graduate students of mine, Amber Alborez and Matt Mickenlauder. Amber got her master's degree with me, and Matt got his master's and PhD. And while they were working together as technicians, they hit it off, and now they are a married couple. So, and then my wife, Dr. Wendy Shelsky, who's also been a large part of the research here. And actually, there is an image of her misnetting some weavers in Uganda, as I was talking about earlier before the talk started. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the types of things that threaten bottomland forest ecosystems. And these threats typically are not only isolated to bottomland forests, but are typical of natural ecosystems in general. And I would say one of the biggest threats, if not the biggest threat to bottomland forest ecosystems, is the loss and fragmentation of bottomland forest habitat. And so habitat fragmentation, it's probably obvious to you what that means, but I like to go through this just because it kind of sets the stage for some of what I'm going to talk about in just a little bit. So habitat fragmentation tends to be the result of when habitat is lost. It's not loss per se, but the loss of habitat tends to fragment habitats. And so you might go from, say, a big block of bottomland forest, and over time, different types of land use are replacing the forest so that you have these remaining patches of habitat that are relatively small and isolated from each other compared to when it was one large area of habitat. When habitats are fragmented in bottomland forests specifically, it tends to reduce biodiversity. So here's an example of a graph where from some of our bird survey data from the Cache River watershed in southern Illinois, if you plot the width of the riparian forest, if you can imagine kind of going from along a bottomland corridor, from the average width of that corridor from one side of the forest, spanning the forest to the other side, usually with agriculture on either side, the wider that bottomland forest, the more species of neotropical migratory birds you document with bird surveys. So when you get out to very wide bottomland forests, you've got a lot more species than narrow ones. This is partly because wider bottomland forests tend to have more habitat heterogeneity, but also a lot of these types of species that are neotropical migrant bird species breeding here in the summer are area sensitive, meaning that they only occur where there's large areas of habitat available for them, and they don't occur where there's little. So when you only have a 100-meter wide corridor, you have very few species relative to corridors that are like greater than 1,000 meters wide. At least in Illinois, that's a very strong relationship. Along with reduced biodiversity, with bird species in particular, there's oftentimes reduced reproductive success because of increased rates of nest predation and also increased rates of cowbird parasitism. So a fragmented landscape, typically a forest embedded within agriculture, tends to promote populations of nest predators and brown-headed cowbirds. So just who are some of the nest predators that are favored by fragmented habitats? These include things like speckled king snakes, black rat snakes, American crows, blue jays, and kind of mesocarnivores like the raccoon. So all of these species don't exclusively feed on nests, but they will feed on eggs and nestlings and even adult birds if they can catch them. And just the fact that there's more of them on the landscape in a fragmented landscape, birds tend to suffer because of that. General patterns of nest predation, kind of around the idea of fragmented bottomland forests. Nest predation tends to be the highest in habitats with lots of edge, meaning you have a lot of places where you have the forest right up against agriculture. The more of that there is, typically the worse birds do because of nest predation. Nest predation tends to also be higher near the edge because predators oftentimes travel along edges. And so they will look just within the forest near the edge, and nests that are there might be more vulnerable. And in small habitat patches, relative to large ones, we tend to see higher rates of nest predation. And in landscapes that are highly fragmented in general. So habitat fragmentation, this kind of like, one, you lose some species, you lose abundances because of the fragmentation, but then the birds that try to nest in those fragmented areas suffer high rates of nest predation. It's kind of like a double whammy. And the triple whammy is that brown-headed cowbirds also are most commonly found in more fragmented landscapes. So a lot of you probably are familiar with brown-headed cowbirds. You probably see them frequently in driving around in central Illinois. They come to your feeders, maybe, if you feed birds. And you may have a love-hate relationship with them, or you might despise them. And I'm going to kind of talk about brown-headed cowbirds fairly extensively for the next bit of my presentation, because they feature prominently in some of the research that I've done. So brown-headed cowbirds are an obligate brood parasite, meaning that they don't build their own nests, they don't incubate their own eggs, they find nests of other species and put their eggs in there. And so here in this picture of a female cowbird on the left and a brown, the male on the right, this is a picture looking down inside of one of my Prothonotary Warbler nest boxes in southern Illinois with 5, which is a typical full clutch of warbler eggs, and 3 cowbird eggs. And so what is it that cowbirds do? They tend to forage in areas of short grass, pasture, and row crop agriculture. So oftentimes, if you have horses or cattle out in a field during the spring and summer, you will oftentimes see a large number of cowbirds down in the grass around where the cattle or horses are foraging. But they will also forage in row crop agriculture, mowed lawns. It tends to be places where you don't have a lot of vegetation on the ground. Then cowbirds tend to move from those areas on a daily basis where they're feeding into nearby natural habitat, where they will search for, find, and monitor nests of hosts in those nearby habitats. When the time is right, when hosts start laying eggs in their nests, the cowbirds are usually very good at getting their own eggs in during that egg laying period. Sometimes they'll remove some of the host eggs, put their own in, but they will parasitize those available nests, and they'll repeat this daily. So these cowbirds have this fairly sophisticated lifestyle of foraging in one area or one habitat, looking for and monitoring nests in another, and then having to get it right in terms of timing their egg laying with that of the host. So who are the most commonly used hosts by cowbirds based on what we've found in a lot of our nesting studies? It tends to be the neotropical migratory bird species, which suffer the most at the hand of brown-headed cowbirds. This is likely because a lot of these species don't have a long evolutionary history with cowbirds, and so they haven't evolved defenses against them. Also, a lot of these species, from those like the water thrush, which nests low, and worm-eating warblers and Kentucky warblers, which nest on the ground or low to the ground, to some of the canopy nesting species or sub-canopy species, they're all good at raising cowbirds. They don't reject cowbird eggs. Cowbird eggs put in these nests oftentimes do fairly well, and oftentimes do better than the host's own eggs and nestlings. So kind of back to the habitat fragmentation angle, I was fortunate to come to Illinois in 1993 when a young scientist at the time named Dr. Scott Robinson was kind of paving the way for really looking at this issue of how habitat fragmentation affects songbirds in terms of cowbird parasitism and nest predation. And here I'll just stay focused on the cowbird side of that. So Dr. Robinson joined up with teams from Indiana, Missouri, and Wisconsin, where large field crews of graduate students and field technicians combed the forests in these different areas and found thousands of bird nests and monitored them and documented what the parasitism rates were like. And then they looked at how much regional fragmentation of the forest there was in these different areas to see how well the amount of that fragmentation predicted the cowbird parasitism rates. And so in a paper published in Science back in 1995, this is just showing the various areas where, from northern Wisconsin, where you have a tremendous amount of forests, to parts of Indiana that are heavily forested, and Missouri that are heavily forested, to other parts of states that have very little forest, relatively speaking, including like Lake Shelbyville area, the Cache River watershed, southwestern Illinois, where we actually have a little bit more forest. But when you take all of this data from all of these regions and you look at rates of cowbird parasitism relative to what percent of the landscape is forested within a 10-kilometer radius around these sites, it was amazing how uniform and stark the effect of the fragmentation was on the percent of nests parasitized. So this is two graphs where the x-axis is the percent of landscape that's forested. So here you basically have almost no forest around the patch of forest you're studying these birds in, to places where you've got, you're studying them in a forest where if you go 10 kilometers in any direction, it's still all forest, and then everything in between. And by modeling the percent of nests parasitized for red-eyed vireos, wood thrushes, northern cardinals, Acadian flycatchers, indigo buntings, worm-eating warblers, ovenbirds, and Kentucky warblers, the message was very, very clear that the amount that the forest is fragmented has a dramatic effect on these parasitism rates, where in landscapes like we have in Illinois, you can't find places where you have high percentages of the landscape that are forested, and the birds tend to get parasitized very, very heavily. And only when you get out into areas where you have 60 to 100% of land within 10 kilometers that's forested do you see low levels of cowbird parasitism. So this has a tremendous conservation message of, we really need to either preserve or restore vast areas of forest where there used to be forest and there currently is not. So for me, flying over Illinois, this is well, actually probably a relatively forested area within Illinois, but it's very typical of what the Cache River watershed in southern Illinois looks like, where you've got patches of forest embedded within kind of a matrix of agriculture. And so, kind of springboarding from that regional scale effect on parasitism, I started doing work in the Cache River watershed and was collecting information from a wide variety of sites where we were maybe looking at Prothonotary warblers in this one swamp right here. And we could look at out within a 3-kilometer radius. So this is kind of the distance where we think cowbird females laying eggs here, they might forage in some of these, in this case, the white areas are agriculture and the green areas are forest. They probably are foraging in some of these agricultural or pasture areas within a 3-kilometer radius of where they're laying their eggs. So do we see an effect of local scale habitat fragmentation on cowbird parasitism rates? So we had a wide variety of sites that had, some had less forest and some had more within this area around the places where we were collecting our data on the nesting prothonotaries. And when we plot that, we got very similar results. And so here each dot represents a different study site with different amounts of forest cover within 3 kilometers. And this is the proportion of nests parasitized. And the same pattern locally that we saw regionally is occurring, where If you have very little forest within that 3-kilometer radius, you suffer high rates of parasitism. And when you get out to 80% local forest cover, you're still at about 40% of the nest getting parasitized. And so here, the landscape in southern Illinois is not heavily forested, but it's highly fragmented. So it's very likely that it's hard to find places in southern Illinois where you have sites that get below 40% parasitism, because there's just not enough forest to get the rates to drop down closer to zero. So while studying the cowbirds and just documenting how many nests are parasitized and how many cowbird eggs per nest are and what the cost of that parasitism is, we started seeing some really interesting patterns emerge that suggested that brown-headed cowbirds may actually use some very sophisticated predatory tactics on their hosts. And another way of phrasing this question was raise my kids or else, and you'll understand better about why that's appropriate. So brown-headed cowbirds and nest failure. So I think everybody's familiar with cowbird eggs in the nest. The cowbirds might take eggs out of the nest, and the cowbird nestling in the nest may get all the food, but they don't actually cause the whole nest to fail, typically. However, at some point, people started putting video cameras on nests, and we're starting to document kind of the minute-by-minute ongoings at these different types of nests of different types of cowbird hosts. And what this video surveillance uncovered was that female cowbirds would occasionally be seen ransacking entire clutches of eggs. So a female cowbird would show up and basically peck, remove, or otherwise destroy all of the eggs in the clutch. Well, why would they do this? In places like Fort Hood, Texas, up in Michigan, where there's Kirtland's warblers in Michigan and black-capped vireos at Fort Hood in Texas and golden cheek warblers, the cowbird removal projects found that when they removed cowbirds from the system, rates of nest predation, so this is where the nest fails because something damages or destroys the eggs or nestlings, rates of nest predation would decrease when the cowbirds were reduced or removed from study systems. So these two things together, one is direct, video surveillance is directly implicating female cowbirds doing stuff. When you remove cowbirds and rates of nest predation go down, that also is very suggestive that cowbirds are playing a role beyond just laying their eggs in nests. And so this video surveillance and cowbird removal experiment came to the conclusion that there might be something called cowbird farming going on. And this is where you find increased rates of nest predation for non-parasitized nests. So cowbird farming is when a cowbird finds an active nest of a potential host. They're out there searching for them every day, looking for them, monitoring them. But sometimes they find a nest that's too far into the nesting cycle that for them to put an egg in it would be useless. The host is already incubating the eggs. The eggs may have just hatched or are just hatching. The cowbird puts an egg in there, that cowbird egg is not going to be successful. So with cowbird farming, the cowbird then, by destroying that clutch or brood, oftentimes stimulates the host to re-nest somewhere else in the same territory, thereby kind of creating an opportunity for that female cowbird to parasitize that new nesting attempt. And so when people started contemplating this idea, it all sounded so sinister, but it actually made a lot of sense if you're coming at it or thinking about it from the perspective of how can a cowbird optimize its situation given the conditions on the ground. So there's been some evidence for cowbird farming. And this includes studies of song sparrows in Canada, Swainson's warblers in Arkansas, red-winged blackbirds in Wisconsin, and spotted towhees in California. And in all of these instances in these studies, they typically found that nests within the study systems that were not parasitized were more likely to be destroyed than nests that had cowbird eggs in them. And they didn't have direct evidence that female cowbirds were doing it, but the correlation suggested they were having, that they were involved. So at this point, while we're all feeling very good about cowbirds and what it is that they do, I like to take a pause, and usually I'm standing in front of a group of people and I ask people to, raise their hand if they like brown-headed cowbirds. And obviously a lot of people don't raise their hands, and because of some of the stuff that I've just been talking about. Then I ask people to raise their hands if they like barred owls or if they like red-shouldered hawks. And everybody raises their hands. Yeah, I love the barred owls, the who cooks for you in the forest. I love listening to that. Seeing red-shouldered hawks in the forest, that's amazing too. And so before I go on with cowbirds, I'd like to point out that when you start filming nests and things going on at nests, you might film cowbirds doing things, but it's definitely not Disney out there. And I harken back to my days as a kid when I would watch the Walt Disney specials on, this is 45 years ago. And there was always a happy animal family where there'd be some kind of peril that beset that family, but in the end, the family was intact and every member of the family of animals was fine. And when you start doing research in nature, you find out that it's definitely not Disney out there. So here's an example of a nest box after dark that has a female Prothonotary warbler incubating the eggs. And I had cameras up to try to document cowbird females doing stuff to nests during the daytime, but the cameras also worked overnight. And so I would look at the film, look at the pictures, and this is one of the things that I actually witnessed by looking at the camera output one night. So this is a barred owl coming in. And this is a series of images that the camera takes over time. It covers the opening, it puts its mouth over the opening, the female warbler tries to fly out and flies into the mouth of the barred owl, and the owl has a little meal to take back to its nest. But I still love barred owls. So here's a daytime image of a different nest box in the same general area where I was trying to document cowbird shenanigans, and was fortunate enough to get this picture on film. And I looked at it and I kind of knew right away, based on the general pattern of this blurry object down here, that it's definitely a red-shouldered hawk. But this was the only picture I got this time around. But then as the camera went on later that day, this is the male Prothonotary warbler, and he's there looking for the female. And I didn't know at the time, but she was no longer on the nest. He flies off. And the next day, there's the male that is the territory owner, and here's another male who's now also coming over to investigate what's going on, maybe seeing an opportunity to usurp the territory or whatever, but two males, but still no female. And then later that second day, a red-shouldered hawk shows up again, poses nicely on top of the nest box, and then comes in a third time and actually reached in and pulled out, or tried to pull out, some of the eggs that were inside. So it would try to perch on the front of the box and reach its foot inside and pull out whatever might be inside, whether that, so it probably got the female and came back to see if maybe there were some yummy nestlings in the box. So these are birds that we love having in the bottomland system, but they are predator, and they will occasionally take some of the birds on our nests or some of the nestlings in our nests. And the boxes are actually on greased poles to keep the raccoons from preying on them. And over time, what we found is that the owls and the red-shouldered hawks seem to learn that these boxes on poles in the forest were like a little candy machine, if you will. So I moved back into cowbirds now after, hopefully you don't feel so bad about cowbirds and what it is that they do. So if cowbirds are capable of farming their host, where they actually create opportunities for more parasitism to occur, what about a cowbird mafia? And so this is something that had been seen in another host-parasite system, which I'll talk about in a second. But the premise here would be, could cowbirds retaliate against hosts if the cowbird eggs are removed from the nest by the host? And to test for farming and mafia in a natural setting requires like this confluence of your ability to control a lot of things that typically you can't control in nature. And it just so happened that the Prothonotary Warbler system I was studying had all the ingredients needed to actually do an experiment to test this out. So one, we had a willing host. We had Prothonotary Warblers nesting in nest boxes. We know that they accept cowbird eggs. And the warbler is a fair amount smaller than a female brown-headed cowbird. Two, we could actually, at the time, before red-shouldered hawks and barred owls became a problem in some places, we could actually, by putting these nest boxes on greased pieces of conduit in the swamps, we could make them almost 100% predator proof because the main predator was raccoons, and raccoons could not get at these nests. So we eliminated essentially snakes and raccoons, which were the usual suspects in terms of preying on nests. But then finally, we could take a nest box that started out with an opening big enough for warblers and cowbirds to fit through. We could slide down an insert and convert that box whenever we wanted to one with a small enough opening that the warblers could still fit through, but the cowbirds no longer could. So we could allow access to female cowbirds, or we could deny access. So set the stage for testing for farming and mafia. So first, looking at the idea of the mafia effect with the experiment that we did. So we wanted to consider all of those warbler nests that were parasitized. So these received cowbird eggs, and we assigned one of 3 treatments to those parasitized nests. We would remove the cowbird egg and continue allowing access to the female cowbird. The second treatment was we would leave the cowbird egg in the nest and still allow female cowbirds access. Or third category, we would take the cowbird egg out and not allow cowbird access. So the response here is, what % of those nests get ransacked? And when I use the word ransacked, I mean the nest is destroyed, messed up, the eggs are broken, so that the nesting attempt is a failure. And if mafia is going on, then you would expect where you take the cowbird eggs out but allow the female cowbird access, that should have a higher level of ransacking than when you leave the cowbird eggs in and cowbird females can still get in, or when you take the cowbird eggs away and no longer allow them the ability to get in the nest box to ransack it. And so this is what we found after we put this experiment out there in the swamp. When we took a cowbird egg out and allowed female cowbirds to continue to be able to get in those boxes, 56% of them were ransacked and failed. And this is what it would look like. So here's the warbler nest after the cowbird egg has been removed. There's still 5 warbler eggs in there. Typically, you'd come back and within 2 or 3 sometimes as many as 4 days later, this is what you would find. It would be a nest that's got broken eggs down in the cup of the nest, or eggs are pulled out of the cup. There's no way that a female warbler can do anything with this nest anymore. It's a failed nesting attempt. When we took cowbird eggs out and allowed when we left cowbird eggs in and continued to allow access, none of those nests were ransacked. Female cowbirds could still go in and out of those nests, but they were left alone. And then finally, the category where we took the cowbird eggs out but no longer allowed access to female cowbirds, none of those nests were ever ransacked either. And so this was the first ever experimental support for Mafia in a brown-headed cowbird and host system. And it was stunning. We saw these strange things happening to our nest boxes, devised this experiment because we could do it. Never did we imagine that the results would be so clear-cut. And so this is support for Mafia. Well, how do you support farming in this experimental design? Well, we had one other category of nests, and that was nests that were not parasitized by cowbirds. So what percentage of nests that were had no cowbird eggs in them, but cowbirds could still get in? And that was 22%. So somewhere between this kind of Mafia effect, that some of these nests where it was never parasitized by a cowbird, they also got ransacked. And this was evidence that there's some farming behavior also going on. So these female cowbirds are capable of both the Mafia and the farming behavior. And they're pretty similar in that if your nest is removed, if your egg is removed from a nest, you ransack it, or if you find a nest that doesn't have a cowbird egg in it and is too far along, you ransack it. So ransacking the nest is similar, but you can see how the one is more retaliatory, the other is more creating an opportunity. And so we spent a lot of time setting up video cameras to try to document some of this actually happening, rather than just manipulating the nest boxes, manipulating whether eggs were removed or not, and the opening sizes, and seeing what happened to the nest. We wanted to catch cowbirds in action. So here's a video of a female cowbird coming in to observe the nest. So she stops, peeks in. This nest had 2 or 3 warbler eggs. Warblers lay 1 egg a day till the clutch is complete. So the warbler, the female cowbird flies in, gets some information saying, this is a good nest to parasitize tomorrow morning. And it just so happened that the very next day, this nest did receive a cowbird egg. So I waited till the warbler completed its clutch, and then I removed that cowbird egg from the nest, and I left the opening size big enough for a female cowbird to get back into. And so then this is what we filmed about, I think, 3 days after removal of the cowbird egg from the nest. And I can't imagine how many M&Ms I ate and coffee I drank while watching sometimes 8 hours of footage on high speed of nothing happening. So when something happened, it's always really exciting and amazing to see. So there's the female cowbird, lands on the box, looks in the box, and at the end of the day, when I went to gather the camera, I went and checked on the nest, in the nest box, and saw that all the eggs had been broken and kind of spread around in the nest so that the nest was failed. One of the really interesting things that I also observed, apart from this potentially being an example of Mafia Effect in action, is that during the day, female cowbirds are lurking in the forest. They're looking for new nests. They're monitoring nests to see when to parasitize them. But it seems like, based on a lot of video footage that I acquired, that they also are somewhere lurking and watching the activity of the female warbler at the nest. Because whenever a female cowbird would come to visit one of these nest boxes, it was almost immediately after the female warbler had left the nest to go get some food. So the warblers will incubate all day, but they leave and take recesses to go get food. And it was very apparent that the female cowbirds are lurking in the forest and watching the boxes so that they don't get caught coming to the box and doing what they do. This research unwittingly ended up being featured in a Nova Science Now episode called Gangster Birds. And it was, they really did a good job in the 11 minutes or so of the segment. And I was so excited that I was going to get to meet Neil deGrasse Tyson. He was going to come to Illinois, but then there was some silly Mars rover or something like that that was going on, where he had to go to Texas to Mission Control to do a show about the rovers landing on Mars. So he did a really cool Godfather-esque introduction to it on the show. And the crew that came from Nova Science Now to Southern Illinois to film some of this was exceptional. So it was, I guess, my 10 minutes, my 10 minutes of fame, based on just monkeying around in a study system long enough to see that weird things are going on, and then doing some novel experiments to figure out what, in fact, these cowbirds are doing. So some ongoing work that's still left undone is, if you'll notice, you may not have, the female cowbird in the videos, was it the same female? Was it two different females? We didn't have color bands on the legs of the female to know. If we did know the female, was the egg in the nest her egg? So there were some additional little details that we still needed to get at. So we're still trying to get at this with ongoing work, where we are actually trying to catch and color band female cowbirds. Here's a female cowbird with an aluminum band over a green band on her right leg, and then a green band over a white band on her left leg. And so the idea being that with cameras, you can document who's coming and when. So here's a female cowbird with two yellow bands on her left leg, and we would know her as an individual. Then you can collect DNA from cowbird eggs, and you can collect DNA from females, and you can use that information to do a maternity analysis and identify that, in fact, the egg in the nest does belong to the particular female that you think it does. So this additional layer of information is necessary for us to be able to take our photographic evidence and apply this new DNA evidence to really, really get at that smoking gun. So here I'm going to wrap up about cowbirds, and I'm going to talk about other things, but I want to just make a few really general conclusions about cowbirds. One, I think that we really, really now know that cowbirds are capable of sophisticated tactics and sophisticated strategies that they use in the process of furthering their own kind. It may not be a traditional build a nest and incubate eggs and feed the nestlings, but some of these behaviors, because they're freed up from all of that work, they can do some of these other things, which enhances their ability to produce more cowbirds. One thing that we don't know is how widespread these behaviors are. The farming behavior seems to be fairly widespread across species and in different parts of the brown-headed cowbird's geographic range. So far, we're the only group that's been able to document the cowbird mafia in our system? And is it because we have a highly manipulated system? Cowbirds learn that the warblers are nesting in the boxes, and we don't really know yet. But it is just really hard to do these types of experiments in any other type of study system. How do you keep a cowbird away from or out of an open cup nest like that of a wood thrush? It's not nearly as easy as keeping them out of a nest box of a small host. And I also like to think that by doing this research and making these discoveries, I think the brood parasites are fascinating and not evil the way that some people would like to portray them. So I will move on to a few other snippets of work. Some of you may be familiar with parts of the Shawnee National Forest in southern Illinois along the western side along the Mississippi River Valley. One project that I was lucky enough to be working on while doing prothonotaries in the swamps was Acadian Flycatcher research in the Uplands over in the Shawnee. And here we had the Hutchins Creek Valley located right here. And it's an example of a really large, by Illinois standards, block of forest that's got this narrow area of agricultural land up along the creek valley, which fragments that big block of forest. So what we wanted to do was to find as many Acadian flycatcher nests as we could along in the forest along this edge, and then as far away from the edge as we could get. So we ended up having nests that were right on the edge of the forest to some that were up to 2 kilometers away in a more intact forest. And so based on fragmentation theory and what we know about fragmentation from a lot of the research that's been done, particularly in the Midwest here, we would expect that if you look at the rate of nest predation relative to the distance you are from that edge, that rates would be high near the edge and low far from the edge. And we'd also predict for cowbird parasitism the same type of thing, because cowbirds tend to focus on the edges more than the interiors because they're then closer to where they forage and where they lay in their eggs. So we went out, we collected about 300 information from 300 Acadian flycatcher nests in this system. So if you take these rates of predation and parasitism, what you would expect then is that the overall success of these flycatchers near the edge is low and far from the edge is high. So we studied Acadian flycatcher nests. This is, many of you may have not ever seen inside of an Acadian flycatcher nest because they're oftentimes between 5 and 20 meters off the ground. They typically lay a clutch of 3 eggs. If they are parasitized, they almost always receive just 1 cowbird egg, because I think the cowbirds know that 2 cowbirds can't survive in an Acadian flycatcher nest. Typically, if an Acadian flycatcher nest is parasitized by a cowbird and that cowbird egg hatches, that nest will fail. In terms of no Acadians will succeed, but only the cowbird will survive. And these nests also are prone to predation by things like snakes and avian predators. So looking at the data that we actually collected for Acadian flycatchers, here nest predation is the dashed line and cowbird parasitism is the solid line. We go from nests that were very close to the edge out to that 2,000 meters away from the edge. We had over 60% of nests failed if they were right on the edge or close to it. And then it decreased fairly dramatically as you got further into where only 20% of the nests were preyed on in the interior of the forest. And with cowbird parasitism, it wasn't a linear pattern, it was a curvilinear pattern where you had really high rates near the edge and they dropped off fairly quickly and then slowly decreased out to that 2,000 meters away from the edge into the forest. So what this meant was that you could draw a line about here, and with moderate rates or lower of nest predation and low rates of cowbird parasitism, we had a lot of area of forest far from the edge that is what we call source habitat, where these Acadian flycatchers were producing enough of their own offspring to sustain or grow their populations. And it's really unusual in Illinois to find source habitat. We think of everything as a sink where they aren't producing enough offspring to maintain or sustain their populations. So we took this information and we could then say that in this area of the Shawnee National Forest, these areas that are close to that long linear agricultural inholding are sink habitat, not good enough to sustain Acadian flycatcher populations. But this interior area of the forest here was actually functioning as source habitat, which is wonderful to know that there are source habitats in Illinois. With this information, the Nature Conservancy, along with the American Land Conservancy and a couple of other organizations that can bring money to bear to try to acquire properties that go up for sale at fair market value. Most of this Hutchins Creek Valley, which consisted of about 4 or 5 different properties, was actually acquired by these groups and rolled into being part of the Shawnee National Forest. And so with that little bit of agricultural inholding purchased, it was only 205 hectares purchased. It actually created 1,350 hectares of source habitat. So you remove that agricultural inholding and the whole area becomes source. So talk about a great bang for the buck. It's like for every hectare purchased, you got 6 hectares of source habitat. So it was a wonderful conservation success story. And we also know that typically what happens for a species like the Acadian flycatcher is not unique to Acadian flycatchers, that we have enough data to say that if things improve for them, lower rates of nest predation and cowbird parasitism, it also likely improved for a lot of these other really amazing birds nesting in the same place. So some of the ground or near ground nesting species like ovenbirds, Kentucky warblers, worm-eating warblers, and Louisiana water thrushes, they also benefited from that acquisition and unfragmenting that part of the forest, as well as a number of species that nest either up in the canopy like the red-eyed vireo and scarlet tanager, or in the subcanopy and shrub layer like wood thrushes, or in shrub layer like hooded warblers. So while we studied Acadian flycatchers, and that was the data that was used to support the acquisition and conservation success story, all these other species likely benefit from that action as well. So taking that idea of unfragmenting areas of forest into a bottomland system, the Cache River watershed has a long, several decades long history of buying areas of land that are in agriculture at fair market value when they come up for sale, and putting trees on the landscape. So they're actually defragmenting the bottomland forest ecosystem there. And when this happens, a lot of different types of bird species that occur there should benefit from that. So we wanted to document how conservation actions benefit birds and then create priorities for subsequent land acquisition within the Cache River watershed. So over time, there were some really dramatic increases in forest cover in this system. So I believe that the joint venture partnership that was working on this wanted to add about 30,000 acres of land to double what currently existed in the Cache River watershed. And over a 25-year period, they actually achieved their goal. So this was a big area that was acquired and reforested, as another area shades in darker green here, other areas here. You can see how suddenly you've got vast blocks of bottomland forest rather than just small isolated patches. And so Cache River watershed-wide conditions, early on when I was here, there was a lot of fragmentation. And overall, cowbird parasitism rates were around 40%. And this is based on Acadian flycatcher nests in the Cache River watershed. 350 of them during this early time period. Almost 20 years later, with all of this reforestation that occurred, there was much less fragmentation, and we went back and we studied for another 3 years in the very same places we did our initial 3-year study. We found that with a sample of 580 Acadian flycatcher nests, I guess we got really good at finding them, that parasitism rates had dropped in half, down to only 20%, which is a relatively decent low rate for Illinois, by Illinois standards. And it's really interesting how some of these dynamics have played out. So here again is that early period, and this square of forest here and this oddly shaped piece here were 2 of our study sites. And at the time, we're surrounded by largely either pasture or row crop agriculture. And so what we documented in these 2 patches in that early period for Acadian flycatchers was that about 30% of the nests were parasitized in this patch, and about 46% were parasitized in this patch. We attributed this difference early on to this area here being up against so much row crop agriculture that the cowbirds were just more common in that area and had more access to the Acadian nests there. By 2010 to 2012, all of this area now shaded in dark green was acquired and put back to forest. So now you've got early successional and even young forest with trees that are really dense and maybe 20 to 30 feet tall in all of these areas here. So this patch here is actually now surrounded by forest for a fairly a good amount in every direction, whereas this area here is still up against all of this agriculture. And if we look at what the parasitism rates were 18 years later, the rates here dropped from 29% down to 9%. Here, they pretty much stayed the same. So this really showed us some tangible benefits of this reforestation effort. It kind of unfolded right before our eyes. But it also required there being a partnership acquiring the land and reforesting it, and also our ability to come up with funding to actually do the research to document whether in fact this was having the effects that we thought they would by reducing the amount of fragmentation. So I'm going to wrap up the lost fragmentation of habitat part and move on really fairly briefly to threats to bottomland forest ecosystems beyond that. So the channelization of streams is another huge threat to bottomland forest ecosystems. There was one that I hadn't thought as much about in terms of how it could affect bird communities until I actually worked in a bottomland system for more than a decade. So here's a topo map of part of the Cache River watershed. This is the Cache River flowing, meandering through here. It goes past Heron Pond, which is this amazing bald cypress swamp located here with a boardwalk out into it. Many of you probably have been there or have maybe seen pictures of it. But if you look at this river kind of meandering the way you'd expect a river to meander and wander through a floodplain, it's pretty stunning to see it then suddenly go straight down to the Ohio River. So it's been channelized about a 6-mile stretch of it to essentially drain the land here for farming. And this was done about 80 to 100 years ago. That channelization there has a dramatic effect on what's happening upstream. So first, I'll darken some areas that are called off-channel wetlands. These are little wetlands that are perched away from the river channel just a little bit, that are there because of the dynamic of flooding and water level changes over time with spring floods and historic floods and such. And what this channelization here does is it puts all of these off-channel wetlands in jeopardy. Because in the springtime, when the river is high, it spills over its banks and occupies the floodplain, and it fills these swamps. However, because of channelization, it creates gullies that connect from the riverbank up into these off-channel wetlands. So here I'm taking a picture from the riverbank, or from the river, up the gully, and then off in the distance is an off-channel wetland. So when the river level goes down in the spring, the water drains through these gullies, and you end up with a swamp that looks like this. It's the same location. Here's springtime, here is midsummer. And it's all because of the channelization downstream, causing these gullies to form, draining the swamps. So it's a two-part solution to this problem. If you can't remove the channelization downstream, you can put riffle weirs to slow the water down, because the channelization causes the water upstream to go faster and faster, which keeps eating the channel of the stream deeper and deeper, which causes the banks to slough, which causes these gullies to form. It's a very predictable hydrologic process. But if you put these big riffle weirs in, essentially it slows the water down upstream, and then the water will accumulate up here, and then will kind of form a ripple over this to the next stretch. Then you've got another one further and further down. So you put these to control any more of the channel incision or the deepening of the channel. And then you put in gully plugs to basically, it's a tiny mini levee that you put in to hold the water in the off-channel wetland and prevent it from being drained every time the river channel, the water river channel drops. And so these gully plugs then actually restore the hydrology to these off-channel wetlands. So again, we had an Adopt a Swamp program. There were birdathons. The DNR got a fair amount of money through those programs to actually implement some of these gully plugs. And I had been working in these swamps prior to this gully plug process, and was able to document some before and after gully plug results to see if these gully plugs would actually improve things for the birds that tended to live in these off-channel wetlands. So the types of species that seemed to benefit were some of the species that depend on these off-channel wetlands, including the Prothonotary warbler, but also yellow-crowned night herons, which nest solitarily, oftentimes in these off-channel wetlands. And they don't go flying great distances to forage. They oftentimes forage right there where their nest is. Yellow-throated warblers, as well as wood ducks and hooded mergansers. All five of these species tended to increase in abundance in wetlands that were treated with these gully plugs. For Prothonotary specifically, like I said, I had a lot of data initially from these off-channel wetlands where they get drained every summer because of the gullies that had formed, which were a result of the channelization. So prior to any gully plugs being put in place, I knew which swamps were going to receive them and which ones weren't. So here the gray bars represent the wetlands that never got a gully plug and are connected to the river via a gully. The yellow bars represent those wetlands where a gully plug was added. So this is prior to gully plugs being added. We studied Prothonotary warblers in these swamps nesting in nest boxes. And we found that, and this is where boxes are on trees and still accessible to predators like raccoons. So the productivity of these warblers, the number of offspring per female per year in these wetlands was relatively low, only about an average of a little more than one offspring produced per female per year. So a lot of failure. And that failure was largely due to raccoons going out in the swamps as the water drained away and preying on the bird nests that were out there. They like walking in water and foraging in water. They don't like swimming. So if the water is deep, the raccoons aren't out there, but these would all drain. So then gully plugs were added here to half of these. And then after the gully plugs were added, what happened to productivity? In these control swamps, still relatively poor productivity, but look at this. The productivity increased fourfold in the swamps that received a gully plug. because these swamps now held water, which was deeper for the duration of the Prothonotary warbler breeding season, and it basically kept the raccoons from going through and preying on all the nests. So because we've been studying Prothonotaries for so long, there are some pretty amazing discoveries that we've had from the detailed data that we've collected over time, particularly with Prothonotary warbler. So, for example, during a 17-year span from 1994 through 2010, every year we would have about 1,500 nest boxes distributed among 20 or more swamps in the Cache River watershed. Each year, we would catch and color mark with bands up to 400 pairs of warblers each year, and document during this time period over 7,500 nesting attempts. So typically, we knew nearly every individual bird in our study system and every nesting attempt, how many cowbird eggs, were they successful or not. And then because we had color marked birds, we also knew if they came back from year to year. So we had all of this really detailed and intimate data on individuals in the system. So one of my favorite results is that we saw initially a pattern that if you look at how many batches of kids or broods a pair of warblers produces in a year, if they don't produce anything, they tended to return at a low level. If they produced one batch of kids, their return the next year to that very same territory or patch of habitat was about 50%, almost 60%. But if they produced two batches of kids in 1 year, nearly 85% of those individuals came back the next year after migrating all the way down to northern South America. We saw this as a correlative pattern with our nests. Then we actually did an experiment where we put some nests, after the females initiated their nests, we put them on greased poles to make them safe from predators. Others we left on the trees and didn't protect them, and we did that at random. So we created 3 classes of pairs of warblers, those that were unsuccessful because raccoons preyed on almost all their nests, those that had one nest out on a set of grease poles, but their other ones were on trees. And then we had some that always got the grease poles and were always successful. And so this experimental data verified the correlative pattern that these birds are actually returning to places where they're successful, which is where they're producing 2 batches of kids, but they are also not coming back to places where they're failing. So we call this decision rules, where because over time, these swamps, if it's a deep swamp, it tends to be good every year. By nesting there and being highly productive, return there and are successful again. Whereas swamps that have shallow water and tend to fail each year, birds that try it there one time fail, and they actually go somewhere else and try to find a better place. So this is, for me, certified evidence that birds often make better decisions than human friends that I have, because I know a lot of friends of mine who have been in a bad situation and end up finding themselves back in a similar bad situation, and they don't learn from it. Whereas these warblers actually come back to good things, but they avoid coming back to bad things. So the whole idea that being called a bird brain used to be an insult, I am happy to be called a bird brain because these birds are really, really smart when you start peeling back the layers of the onion. Because we've had this long-term data, historically, it's been thought that Prothonotary warblers, being a 13 or 14 gram neotropical migrant, they got to fly back and forth between South America and breeding grounds North America every year, that their life expectancy is probably 2 to 4 years on average, and maybe a couple birds live to be 6 or 5 years old. Well, we started studying them in '94 with color bands on them, and did so for then the next 25 years. And what we discovered was that we had a male that was at least 12 years old, and we had a female that was at least 11 years old. So this more than doubled what people thought to be kind of the longevity records for this species. And I think it just goes to show that when you start studying a system in great detail and over a long period of time, if you're fortunate enough to be able to do that, you can really tackle some of the dogma that exists about what these types of rates, what people think they are without necessarily having enough data to say so. Because these birds can live for a long time, relatively speaking, and we know that they can be highly successful, and we were documenting for individual birds how many offspring they produced. We had information over a 6-year period where we had a female. This is just her color band combination, purple, light blue, silver, purple. She produced 35 offspring in that 6-year period. And then we had a male, not necessarily her mate during that same time period, who produced 38 offspring. So he was responsible for 38 offspring. Then my wife started doing some work in the system, looking at paternity, where you take blood samples from the males and females, and then also take blood samples from the nestlings that are being produced in the system. And she found that this male not only had 38 of his own offspring, but he produced 9 more with other females during 4 years of that 6-year period. So his total was actually 47. So he had nestlings in other nest boxes where he had had some extra pair matings with other females. So these are stunning numbers, and nobody had ever thought that a little Prothonotary warbler in its lifetime could produce this many offspring. So here's our study system in Southern Illinois in the United States. Over the years, we banded over 10,000 Prothonotary warbler nestlings. So these nestlings are not dead in my hand, they are just warm and happy, and they tend to continue to sleep in a warm situation if they're well fed. So we can take the warblers' nestlings out of the nest boxes and apply aluminum leg band that's got a unique number on it, put them back in the nest box. Eventually they fledge from the box. And then their first fall, they have to migrate from where they were born down to where they winter, and they typically winter in this area down here. Then the next spring, they got to come all the way back. And a question that's eluded, or an answer that's eluded people, is the question of, do birds produced in a particular area tend to come back to that area, especially if you have to migrate that far? Or do warblers that we produce breed down in Louisiana or somewhere over in Virginia? Or do they actually come back to the Cache River watershed where they were produced? You have to band a lot of nestlings to even contemplate answering this question. And so we set out, after having banded close to 12,000 warbler nestlings over several years, we set out to look for prothonotaries within our study sites and the broader study system that came back and were wearing a single silver band. So here's a female warbler that's now breeding, and she's an adult, but she only has a silver band on her leg. And we weren't aware of anyone else banding Prothonotary warblers locally and just putting silver bands only on them. So fortunately, we can catch these birds and see what their band number is and identify that they were in fact a nestling produced in our system in a previous year. So as a master's project, Matt McKimlouder started out by looking within our primary study area where we've got nest boxes, which is the blue, light blue shaded area here, where we're catching nearly everybody in the course of studying them in their nest boxes. But he also went into any appropriate habitat in this buffer around those sites to see if he could find other individuals just wearing aluminum band only, catching those individuals and then verifying where it was that they came from. And then we expanded out further from that to look for warblers in any suitable habitat, all the way out more than 30 kilometers away from where it was we were banding all of these nestlings. So again, we're looking for birds that were born in the system, that returned in a subsequent year and are now breeding in the system. What did we find? When you look at all of the individual warblers that we could document that existed within this inner ring here, about 15% of the individuals that we looked at had an aluminum band only, meaning that they were actually, so 15% of the breeding population were actually nestlings produced in a previous year. When we went out in the first 5-kilometer layer around that, only 1% of the breeding population had been a nestling produced in the system. And then the further out we went, we just found lots of warblers, but none of them were bearing a single aluminum band on their legs. So this we thought was fairly stunning, because a lot of times people think that with a long distance migrant that the birds don't come home and breed locally where they're produced, but they actually breed further away. And we actually found the opposite, that in fact, the birds produced locally come back and breed locally. And so these local conservation efforts really then, you can show, benefit local populations. So just a couple more quick vignettes, and then I will wrap up here. So because we had all of this long-term data, we could actually contemplate what potential role global climate change might be having on Prothonotary warblers breeding in our system. And so we focused on warmer spring temperatures and how that might affect first egg dates for the Prothonotary warblers in our system. This is just showing from about 1985 through the nearly present time, global tendency for warming. So our planet's warming. This is the annual global land temperature anomaly. So if the values are above 0, it means that it's a year when it's warming, and the greater the value is above 0, the more warming it is. And this is corresponding April average mean daily temperature in southern Illinois. And so this is a fairly tight correlation, and this is a more variable correlation, but still a very significant correlation of warming spring temperatures in southern Illinois locally. So sometimes on parts of the globe, the warming actually causes cooling, but in general, the globe is warming. In fact, here, April temperatures, when the warblers arrive in southern Illinois to breed, we've seen over time warming temperatures. So can we see signal that this is having an effect on when it is the warblers are laying their eggs early in the season when they arrive and start nesting? So what we found by studying 20 years of data from our system, where we had first egg dates for known females, and we also had the local April temperatures in that year over a 21-year period, what we found is that there's a very strong pattern both for older females, which is the red line here, and younger females. So these are 1-year-old females, and these are birds that are older than 1 year. The colder the average daily temperature in April is, the later it is that they lay their first eggs. So here, first egg dates, this number 132 represents the 12th of May. This would be the 14th of May, the 16th of May, and so on. So the farther up this you go, the later it is. So in a cold April, they start laying their eggs later. But in warm springs, they lay their eggs earlier. So temperature is definitely driving the timing of breeding for warblers as they arrive in our study system. And what we found through looking at eBird data from all over the country during spring months is that it's not that the warblers are arriving sooner, it's that they're arriving at about the same time, but they're waiting longer if it's a cold spring, and starting earlier after arriving if it's a warm spring. So what are the ramifications of starting later or starting based on the spring temperatures? Well, what we found is this pattern where the number of offspring per female per year tends to be significantly higher when spring temperatures are warm and the birds start breeding early. And it's significantly lower in years that are cold when they start nesting later. And what we speculate is that the reason for this, basically in warmer springs, they're producing more offspring is because they've got more time in their breeding season to have a chance at producing 2 broods of young. So if they're starting later in the season, the end of the breeding season creeps up on them more quickly, and they don't necessarily have time to attempt a second brood after successfully fledging a first. Whereas in warm springs, they start earlier, and it gives them more time. And so here we plot the probability of females fledging 2 broods, and that probability increases the warmer the April temperature is. So here we have a circumstance where oftentimes global warming eventually can create a mismatch between when pulses of resources that are really important for an organism happen, especially for migratory species, and you end up with a mismatch where the peak in the resources no longer matches the peak in the breeding. Well, it seems like in these bottomland forest systems, because they are so energetically rich and biodiverse, there are, for an insectivore like the Prothonotary warbler, a lot of insects for them to eat. And if you have a warm spring, those insects might start emerging sooner, and it's not, and the birds start breeding sooner, so it's not offsetting that yet. One thing that, so in current terms, in warmer years, the Prothonotary warblers do better. But I would be mistaken to say that, well, you know, let's bring on the global warming because the Prothonotaries benefit from it. There's so many things that don't. And one thing that we also fear is that as warming continues, who knows what kinds of effects that's going to have on the really important and delicate balance of hydrology and hydrodynamics in these bottomland forest systems. That is what drives the productivity and the production of insects, and also keeps the warblers safe from predators like the raccoon. So we are happy that the warblers are currently thriving in the current climate, but we are concerned that with continued warming, something is likely going to be affected adversely for the Prothonotaries. And with continued monitoring of these populations, we can document that as it happens. So I will wrap up by saying that hopefully with all of these examples that I've talked about, that you've come away with the idea that conservation efforts, when applied to bottomland forests and upland forests, they can in fact increase nesting success, whether it's reforesting areas, reducing fragmentation, or improving off-channel wetlands by putting gully plugs in place. This increased nesting success to increased productivity of the species of birds that are breeding there, which has 2 benefits. One, we've documented that it increases the adults returning the next year to try and breed there again in these good places. And it also increases the number of fledglings that return to breed. And so those 2 things in concert create source populations right here in Illinois. And back in the early 1990s, I remember Scott Robinson telling me that he had no evidence to say that there was any place in Illinois that was a source habitat for birds, at least for like migratory songbirds breeding in forests. And I'm happy to say that we've now discovered that through some of these conservation efforts that has changed. So in the end, I hope that you can appreciate that birds do in fact have much to tell us. We can discover what types of things are threatening their populations by studying them. And we can also determine what the responses to restoration and conservation efforts are. So birds do have much to tell us. We just need to continue listening to them. And with that, I will acknowledge a wide number of organizations, agencies, and NGOs that have supported the research that we've done. And I'd also like to thank the Cache River Joint Venture Partnership, which specifically the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Nature Conservancy of Illinois, and so many superb field assistants and collaborators. I get to sit and tell you about all this cool stuff, and I fortunately was able to spend 20 years or more in the field collecting the data, but I had so many people that have helped to kind of make this research program thrive. And I'm so thankful to have had the opportunity to do so. So with that, I thank you for your attention. I'm sorry that this went fairly long. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I'm happy to answer questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I'm sure everybody here agrees that that was incredibly interesting. I for sure learned a lot. I have some questions, but I always ask my questions first. So today I will go to the chat and ask the chat questions first.
Okay.
So I'll read the question just for folks that are not able to access the chat. So the first question is from Jay Van Cleef, and the question is, are the cowbirds able to control egg production in such a way that the mafia behavior is actually just farming to get a second chance at the same host?
Right. Okay. Thank you for the question, Judy. So what I guess evolutionarily is the main distinction between the farming and the mafia behavior. The farming behavior and the mafia behavior both create new opportunities. However, the mafia behavior also has the potential evolutionarily to prevent a host from throwing cowbird eggs out. So it's actually the idea that the host is going to learn that I threw this foreign egg out of my nest, but then my nest failed. So the cowbird in both farming and mafia behaviors does gain another opportunity, but it already tried putting an egg into the nest in the mafia scenario. And so that's where it becomes a, we call it retaliatory, but in evolutionary terms, it's just creating selection for a host to not throw cowbird eggs out. The warblers that we were studying accept cowbird eggs. So they were kind of the unwitting hosts, if you will, where it was us, the researchers, that removed the cowbird eggs from those nests. And we just wanted to see if, in fact, that elicited a response by female cowbirds. The female cowbirds are not so territorial in the forest that be farming and mafia happening, and we sometimes mistake the mafia, we call it mafia, but it actually is farming. So another scenario would be where we take a female cowbird's egg out of a warbler nest, and a separate female, not the one who laid the egg in the nest, but a separate female comes and finds that nest that's too far along, and they ransack it to create an opportunity that has nothing to do with mafia. Because the mafia treatment in our experiments had 56% of ransacking occurring, and only 22% of the non-parasitized nests were ransacked, we basically assumed that at least 36% of the ransacking in the Mafia treatment group was actually Mafia behavior. So it's somewhat splitting hairs. In both circumstances, the farming Mafia create opportunities, new opportunities for cowbirds. The farming has no bearing on a host's rejection behavior because there was never a cowbird egg in the nest to begin with. Whereas with the Mafia behavior, it actually is the same ransacking, but it's in response to the egg of the cowbird being removed by the host that the female cowbird comes back and does that.
Okay, the next question is, are the results you found the same for nest box studies and natural or naturally occurring nests?
Yes, so the first 2 years in the system, 1993 and 1994, I started dabbling by putting nest boxes up. They're made from half-gallon milk and juice cartons, modified. Takes 2 cartons to make 1 nest box. It's the cheapest research I've ever done in terms of cost. And you can actually carry 60 nest boxes through a swamp at one time because it's you put them in garbage bags and you tape them on trees. During that first 2 years, we also found natural cavity prothonotary nests in the same swamps. And what we found was that the opening sizes of those cavities, natural cavities, were very similar to the opening sizes we were using in nest boxes. The cowbird parasitism rates of the natural cavities, when you controlled for opening size, were the same as the ones for our nest boxes. And the rates of nest predation of nest boxes taped to trees and natural cavities were identical. And it was because raccoons are very able to, if it's shallow water in a swamp, they wander around out there looking for crayfish and other things to eat. The warblers typically will chip back to their nest, whether it's a nest box or a natural cavity, and the raccoons would prey on nests over shallow water equally well, whether it was a natural cavity or a nest box. This made me feel very good that the stigma of studying things in nest boxes not being relevant to the natural world or the natural way in which these birds would otherwise nest, I could say, well, I've got the information to say that what's happening in the natural cavities is very similar to what's happening in the nest boxes. And then ultimately, by putting nest boxes out in the swamps, the warblers didn't increase in density, which oftentimes happens if a species of bird is cavity limited. You put up nest boxes and you just get a higher density over time. For the warblers, they just switched from natural cavities to almost entirely exclusively using our nest boxes. And if rates of nest predation because of raccoons were high, the densities on that site would go down because the birds wouldn't come back after they failed, so you'd slowly see decreasing numbers. But if the nests were really successful, the densities could sometimes double or triple over the matter of years. And this was all tied into the hydrology of the swamp. A deep swamp promoted low rates of nest predation by raccoons, which promoted a high amount of reproductive success, high returns of those adults. And when you've got a swamp with a lot of birds already at it, and a bird's looking for a new place to breed for the first time, or it's leaving a bad site from the previous year, where do you go? You go to the place where all the other birds are. So there was this kind of idea of good sites bringing the birds back to it and attracting other birds to it. So we saw this buildup of densities over time in some of these sites, but it wasn't because of nest boxes. It was because of the success of the birds in those sites.
Okay, so then we have a question from Jeff Bryant. The curve you showed for Acadian flycatchers or flycatcher nests showed a noticeable curve deviation from the linear behavior for warbler nests. Could this be because the flycatcher nests are higher in the canopy than the cowbird would like?
That's a really good question. Yeah, when you're comparing different hosts, it may be the kind of thing. So I'll give an adaptive story as kind of my educated guess at why it's the difference. Acadian flycatchers tend to nest in the subcanopy to canopy from the edge to the interior. Prothonotary warblers are always down low. As you move away from the edge in the upland forests where the Acadians were in Hutchins Creek, you go from a fairly poor, so there's not as many species of host available for cowbirds at the edge. So if you're an Acadian flycatcher, you're an indigo bunting, you're a whatever nesting near the edge, and you're much more likely to get a cowbird egg because there's not a lot of other hosts near the edge. So a female cowbird that's searching along the edge has fewer opportunities. Whereas the further in you go from the edge, the Acadian flycatcher nests are now in a place where you've got Kentucky warblers, worm-eating warblers, wood thrushes, scarlet and summer tanagers, several species of vireo, all as hosts that, so the host richness increasing into the interior of the forest likely is kind of causing that curvilinear relationship for Acadian flycatchers in the uplands. That's my guess anyways. So that for Acadians at least, it'd be interesting because I bet that if I look at Acadian flycatchers in the bottomland forest system, it might be more of a linear relationship. And actually, so the prothonotary relationship was not distance to edge. So, okay, I'm sorry. Now I'm actually realizing. The Acadian relationship that was the curve is how far are you from the edge? The linear relationship for the prothonotaries was how much forest is in the 3-kilometer radius around you, which is a different fragmentation metric. So my guess is if you looked at prothonotaries nesting near the edge versus far from the edge, you'd find the ones nesting near an edge also are much higher, and it would drop off precipitously and then kind of be more gradual. Sorry, it took me a moment to think of the two different graphs, and the x-axis on each of those graphs is different. For Acadians, it's distance to edge. For prothonotaries, it's the percent forest cover within a certain radius. And they are two quite different things.
I also have one last question, and my question relates to the DNA projects that you are doing on the cowbirds. I was wondering, and this might not make sense for bird systems, but are you considering things like relatedness? So whether relatedness would have an impact on whether the bird destroys the egg or not?
Oh, so you mean for the cowbird or
Yeah.
for the warbler? Okay.
For the cowbird, yeah.
Right. We don't have enough of the necessary photographic evidence to know the answer to that question yet. I thought you were going to go down the road with prothonotaries and like do male and female prothonotaries avoid mating with each other if they're closely related, which my wife has done an entire dissertation on some of that types of stuff. With the cowbirds and the genetics, primarily what we've done with it so far, aside from the Mafia, is we've been looking at just the cowbird mating system. So how many different female cowbirds can we detect in a swamp laying her eggs in prothonotary warbler nests? And do we, the same female, even if we recreate her genetically based on the eggs that we're sampling, do we see her coming back to the same swamp year after year? And sometimes interacting with the same hosts year after year. We don't have camera systems set up well enough to actually document that a particular female is so destroying cowbird eggs. Yeah. So we know cowbirds lay eggs in nests. They often remove host eggs, but a cowbird couldn't, in theory, remove other cowbird eggs from a nest in terms of competing with them. We also know that some female cowbirds tend to move around the forest together, and we've often wondered if we potentially have female coalitions of related individuals working together. You find 3 cowbird eggs in a nest. Sometimes it's from 3 separate individual females. Sometimes it's all 3 from the same female. We don't really have any info, so we know all of that. We tend to know how many male cowbirds mate with females. Typically, male cowbirds move around in the forest, and they don't really help find nests. They don't monitor nests. The males tend to want to be out there to show the female cowbirds how awesome they are. So male cowbirds will actually move around with other male cowbirds, and there will be pecking order within that group of male cowbirds, where there's a dominant male, and he benefits from having other males around him, because if he's the dominant male, then the female will preferentially mate with him if he's got a lot of that he's keeping in line. So we know all of that about the mating system. We don't yet know when female cowbirds destroy other cowbird eggs, or if they destroy other cowbird eggs, and if there's a relatedness component to that. So every time we find out more information, we find out it's just another tip to another big iceberg. And so that idea that you just posed is another one where we need to get these nest boxes wired with tiny cameras in the lids that, and then you can only see the cowbird's head coming in. So you don't even necessarily know who the cowbird is. So then you need cameras on the outside and on the inside simultaneously. You need to be able to catch female cowbirds, which is not an easy task. So we are slowly picking away at some of these things. So I guess stay tuned. But when you study the genetics and kind of the mating systems, you uncover some really amazing things, because growing up as a kid, I'm like, oh, the pair of robins in my yard, they're a happy pair. They're monogamous. It's the same pair in the same yard every year. And it's like, absolutely not. There might be a pair that's together, but oftentimes the females may solicit matings from other males in the area, and some of the eggs in the nest belong to other males. The males may also participate in extra pair matings with neighboring females. And you don't necessarily see all of that until you kind of start looking at the genetics of who's mating with who. And so there's so many questions about that with cowbirds relating to some of their less savory behaviors that we still have to tackle in the system.
We'll just have to invite you back in a few years' time.
And I promise I'll give you a talk that's only 40 minutes long. I get so excited talking about this stuff, and I just have been so fortunate to spend as much time in the field as I did prior to having kids, which I'm an old timer with young kids, and I'm happy to be in that situation. But I really relish the almost 24, 25 years of just spending 4 months every year doing nothing but field work in upland forests, but then in bottomland forests in particular, and roaming some swamps in southern Illinois that people probably have never roamed in for a long time. The things that you see by being out in nature lead to scientific discovery, and I feel very fortunate, like I said, to have had the opportunity to do that. And I really, enjoy having the opportunity to talk to all of you about that. So thanks again for inviting me to talk.
I'm pretty sure everybody here enjoyed having you talk to us. Thank you very much, Jeff. With that, I'm going to end tonight's talk. Thank you, everybody, for attending. It was lovely seeing you all. And I posted the link to the CCAS website in case anybody needs any more information.
And if any of you have follow-up questions, you can certainly email me with other questions. I'm happy to respond and correspond with you about those.
Sounds good. Okay. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.